Her tiny fingers trembled as she clung to the sleeve of the man she had run to as though her life depended on it. Tears streaked down her cheeks, cutting through the dirt and dried blood on her face. Her voice cracked apart as she begged. "They're hurting my mama! Please, please help her!" The dining room fell silent. Forks hovered in midair. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations died at once, as though someone had shut off the sound in the entire room. Because the man she had latched onto wasn't just any diner. He was Emilio Costa, the most feared Mafia boss on the entire East Coast. And what he did next would leave every soul in La Rosetta questioning reality. But before we dive deeper into this story, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to comment down below where you're watching from. Because what happened that night shocked even the men who had seen Emilio end wars with a single command. It was a late Thursday evening inside La Rosetta, the kind of restaurant where billionaires whispered, politicians pretended they weren't corrupt, and every waiter knew the rules. Don't stare. Don't listen. Don't speak unless spoken to. Especially when Emilio was present. Tonight, he sat at his private table, black suit perfectly tailored, dark hair slicked back, the ink of old tattoos curling along his wrists where his cuffs didn't quite hide them. His expression was carved from stone. His lieutenants spoke to him in low measured tones, reviewing operations, numbers, and territories. Efficiency in human form. To Emilio Costa, emotion was a liability. Weakness got you killed. And he had sworn long ago never to feel anything that could be used against him again. But then the restaurant doors burst open so violently they slammed against the wall. Every head turned. A small black girl, maybe 6, stumbled inside. Her pink dress was torn, one sleeve ripped entirely. A thin scratch ran down her cheek, and her chest heaved as if she had run miles without stopping. She looked like she had escaped a battlefield. The maitre d' rushed forward, startled, but froze when she darted past him. Her wide, terrified eyes scanned the room, sweeping over million-dollar suits, glittering jewelry, and faces twisted in annoyance. Then she saw him. Emilio. Something in her tiny trembling body recognized him instantly, not as danger, but as power. As the only force in the city who might save her. She ran. She dodged chairs, nearly tripped on a rug, and before his guards could intercept her, she reached Emilio's side and grabbed onto him with both hands like he was a lifeline in a storm. "Please!" she sobbed. "They're hurting my mama!" A collective gasp swept across the room. Because no one, not senators, not rival bosses, not even Emilio's own men, had dared touch him uninvited in over 20 years. Emilio stared down at the child clinging to him. Her dark eyes glistened with terror and pleading, so much pleading it cut through him like a blade. And in that split second, something deep inside Emilio cracked, a memory he had buried under concrete, and blood rose up, the face of his own daughter. The one he lost. The one he couldn't save. He inhaled sharply, an old wound tearing open. The room waited with bated breath. And as Emilio slowly lowered himself to one knee before the shaking little girl, every man in that restaurant realized something impossible was happening. The coldest heart in the underworld was beginning to thaw. And that's where this story truly begins, with the night a child shattered the walls Emilio Costa swore would never break again. Emilio's guards moved instantly, hands reaching to pry the child away. "Don't!" Emilio said quietly. The single word stopped them cold. His men exchanged glances. In 15 years of service, they had never seen him hesitate. Not once. Emilio's dark eyes studied the trembling girl. Her grip on his sleeve was desperate, knuckles white, as if letting go meant drowning. He could feel her whole body shaking. He softened his voice, something he hadn't done in years. "What's your name?" She hiccuped through her tears. "Amelia." "Amelia," he repeated, steady and calm. "Tell me what happened." The words tumbled out between sobs, fractured and raw. They came to our door, big men, yelling about money Mama didn't have. Her voice cracked. They said she owed them. But she doesn't. She works 2 jobs. She told them, but they wouldn't listen. Emilio's jaw tightened. They pushed inside. Amelia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. They grabbed her, started hitting her. The memory crashed over her like glass breaking. The pounding on the door. Fists like thunder. Open up, Rhonda! Time's up! Her mama's frightened face as she unlocked the chain. There must be some mistake. The door exploded inward. 3 men. Huge. Angry. No mistake. Marcus said you'd pay. You haven't. I don't know any Marcus. Please, my daughter's here. A hand across her mother's face. The sickening sound of the slap. Amelia had scrambled under the kitchen table, hands clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. Her mama fought back. Kicked. Clawed. They hit her again. And again. Please! Her mama screamed. Please stop! But they didn't. One of them noticed Amelia. Started toward the table. Leave her alone! Rhonda's voice, desperate and breaking. In the chaos, Amelia bolted. Out the back. Through the window. Down the rusted fire escape, her pink dress catching on metal, tearing. She ran until her lungs burned. Why did you come here? Emilio asked, his voice low. Amelia looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes that had no business trusting anyone, least of all him. I heard the men on our block talking, she whispered. They said if you can't go to the police, you go to Costa. That you fix things nobody else can. Silence. The room held its breath. This child had run through the night to find a monster because the monsters who were supposed to protect her had failed. She had chosen him. Emilio stood slowly. His expression was unreadable, but something behind his eyes had shifted, a door opened that had been welded shut for a decade. Marco, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Get the car. His lieutenant blinked. Boss, the meeting. Cancelled. Shock rippled through his men. Emilio Costa didn't cancel meetings. He didn't change plans for anyone. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, he broke his own rules. He looked down at Amelia and extended his hand. Show me where they took your mother. The Mercedes glided through the midnight streets like a shadow, its engine a low purr cutting through the silence. Streetlights flickered past in rhythmic intervals, casting brief flashes of amber across the dark interior. Amelia sat beside Emilio in the back seat, her small frame rigid despite the leather luxury surrounding her. Tears still rolled down her cheeks, silent now, exhausted. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching the city blur past. Emilio stared straight ahead, jaw set, hands folded in his lap with military precision. But inside, his mind was screaming. Because every soft whimper from the child beside him was a dagger twisting in a wound he thought had scarred over years ago. He was drowning in memory. A different night. A different car. Sophia in the back seat, laughing. 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, telling him about her school play. She was going to be a butterfly. She'd been practicing her wings all week. Papa, will you come watch me? I'll be in the front row, mi amor. The stoplight. Red bleeding into the darkness. Then, gunfire. Glass exploding inward like a constellation of stars. Screams. His driver slumped forward. Blood everywhere. Emilio had thrown himself over Sophia, but he was too late. The bullet meant for him had found her instead. He held her as the life drained from her eyes, her small hand going limp in his. Her butterfly wings would never spread. Her laughter would never echo in his home again. The men responsible were dead within 24 hours. But it didn't bring her back. Nothing brought her back. So Emilio buried his heart with her. Built walls of steel and ice around what remained. Made a vow on her grave. Never again. Never care. Never feel. Never let anyone close enough to be used as a weapon against him. For 10 years he'd kept that promise. A small movement pulled him back to the present. Amelia had shifted closer, inch by hesitant inch, until her shoulder pressed against his side. She was still crying, but softer now, as though his presence alone had muted her terror just enough to breathe. She trusted him. This stranger. This killer. This man whose hands had ended more lives than he could count. She had chosen him to save her mother. Emilio's throat tightened. His hands clenched into fists. The universe was cruel. Vicious. It had thrown him back into the exact nightmare he'd spent a decade running from, a terrified child, a mother in danger, and the crushing weight of being someone's only hope. He should turn the car around. Drop her at a hospital. Walk away. Let someone else carry this burden. But when he looked down at Amelia's tear-stained face, he saw Sophia staring back at him, not with accusation, but with a question he'd never been able to answer. Would you save me if you had another chance? His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Marco. Call Dr. Reeves. Tell him to prepare a full trauma kit and meet us at. He glanced at Amelia. What's your address? She whispered the street name, barely audible. Marco turned from the front seat, eyes wide. Boss, we've never. Now! Emilio said, the word like a blade. Marco made the call. In the passenger seat, his Lieutenant Vince exchanged a look with the driver. Silent. Stunned. Emilio Costa didn't intervene personally. He gave orders. Delegated. Stayed 3 steps removed from the blood and chaos. He never showed up himself. And yet here he was, racing through the city at midnight with a child pressed against his side, about to walk into a situation he'd sworn never to face again. The car slowed as they turned into a rundown neighborhood, flickering neon signs, cracked sidewalks, buildings that sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. The kind of place the city forgot. The kind of place where people vanished and no one asked questions. Amelia sat up straighter, her small hand clutching Emilio's sleeve again. There, she whispered, pointing to a narrow brick building with rusted fire escapes climbing its face like exposed bones. 4th floor. The Mercedes pulled to a stop. Emilio stepped out into the cool night air, his coat billowing slightly as the door closed behind him. His men emerged from the vehicle, weapons concealed but ready, eyes scanning for threats. He looked up at the building, dark windows, crumbling facade, secrets bleeding from every crack. Somewhere up there, a mother was dying. And for the first time in 10 years, Emilio Costa allowed himself to care. The door hung off its hinges like a broken jaw. Emilio pushed it open with 2 fingers, the wood groaning in protest. The smell hit him first, copper and sweat and fear, thick enough to taste. He stepped inside. The apartment was a war zone. A coffee table lay on its side, one leg snapped clean off. Shattered glass glittered across the floor like vicious stars. Family photos had been ripped from the walls, frames crushed under boots. A child's drawing, a stick-figure family under a crooked sun, was trampled in the corner, torn in half. Blood smeared across the linoleum in dark, dragging streaks. Emilio's men fanned out behind him, weapons drawn, checking the tiny kitchen, the single bedroom. Silent. Professional. But he could see it in their eyes, the disgust, the anger. Even men like them had lines. Clear! Marco called out. But Emilio had already seen her. Rhonda lay crumpled near the hallway, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, her face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Her work uniform, a diner's apron and faded blue shirt, was torn and stained with blood. Her chest rose and fell in shallow labored breaths. Barely alive. Mama! Amelia's scream tore through the apartment like a siren. She bolted forward, but Emilio caught her before she could reach the broken glass, his hands firm on her shoulders. Don't, he said quietly, kneeling to her level. You'll cut your feet. But Mama! I know. His voice was steady and anchoring. Let me help her first. Amelia's lip trembled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but she nodded. Emilio stood and moved toward Rhonda with the careful precision of a man who had seen too much death to be careless with life. He crouched beside her, checking her pulse, weak, thready, but there. Internal bleeding most likely. Broken ribs. Possible concussion. She needed a hospital. But hospitals asked questions. And questions brought police. He made his choice in a heartbeat. Emilio slid one arm beneath Rhonda's shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, unconscious, blood staining his expensive suit. His men froze. Vince's mouth actually fell open. Marco stared like he was witnessing a miracle. Because Emilio Costa didn't carry people. He didn't touch. He didn't get his hands dirty with the aftermath. He gave orders, and others executed them. But here he was, cradling a dying woman in his arms like she mattered. Like her life was worth more than the empire he'd built on violence and fear. "Boss, we can't," Marco started. "Open the door," Emilio said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marco obeyed. Emilio carried Rhonda down the narrow hallway, Amelia clinging to his coat, her small fists twisted in the fabric as though letting go meant losing both of them. Her sobs were muffled against his side, her whole body shaking. Outside, Dr. Reeves was already waiting beside a black SUV, medical bag in hand. He was in his 50s, gray-haired, calm under pressure, the kind of doctor who didn't ask questions and never appeared in hospital records. "Passenger seat now," Reeves ordered. Emilio eased Rhonda into the vehicle with surprising gentleness. Reeves immediately went to work, stethoscope, IV line, checking vitals with practiced efficiency. "Broken ribs, internal bleeding, severe trauma," Reeves muttered, his hands moving fast. "She needs surgery, but I can stabilize her here. Keep her breathing." "Do it," Emilio said. Amelia tried to climb into the SUV, but Emilio caught her hand. "Let the doctor work," he said softly. "But she'll be okay." The words surprised even him. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. But something in those wide, terrified eyes demanded it. "I won't let anything happen to her." Amelia stared up at him, searching his face for a lie. She found none. Slowly she nodded, but her fists remained locked around a fistful of his shirt, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her collapsing world. Emilio stood there, a Mafia boss with a child clinging to him and a dying woman bleeding in his SUV, and felt the weight of something he'd buried long ago. Responsibility. He turned to Marco, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Find out who did this." His eyes were black ice. "I want names. I want addresses. I want to know who they work for and who gave the order." Marco nodded sharply. "Yes, boss." "And Marco?" "Sir?" Emilio's gaze didn't waver. "We find them tonight." The call came through at 2:47 a.m. Emilio stood in the safe-house kitchen, watching through the doorway as Dr. Reeves worked on Rhonda in the adjoining room. IV bags hung like translucent ghosts. The steady beep of a heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the silence. His phone buzzed. Marco's name lit the screen. "Talk," Emilio said. "We got them. 2 enforcers. Marcus Reed and Tony Galloway." Marco's voice was clipped and efficient. "They're part of the Iron Jacks." Emilio's jaw tightened. The Iron Jacks. A crew that had been crawling out of the Bronx like rats from a sinking ship, pushing into territories they had no business touching. Young. Reckless. Hungry for power they hadn't earned. "The Jacks?" Emilio repeated, his voice flat. "Yeah." Marco paused. "Boss, there's more. This wasn't about money." Emilio's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "We ran Rhonda Mitchell's name. She's clean. No debts. No connections. Works 2 jobs, diner during the day, cleaning offices at night. She's nobody. Then why target her?" "Because of where she lives. 4th Street corridor, right on the edge of your South Territory. The Jacks have been moving product through there for weeks, testing your boundaries." Marco's tone darkened. Rhonda filed a complaint with building management about suspicious activity. Someone saw the report. The pieces clicked into place like bullets sliding into a chamber. They beat her to send a message, Emilio said quietly. Exactly. Create chaos. Make it look random. Get you to overreact or ignore it. Either way, they win. Marco exhaled sharply. They're trying to provoke a war, boss. They want you to make the first move so they can claim self-defense to the other families. Emilio's hand tightened around the phone. A mother beaten half to death. A child traumatized. All because some upstart crew wanted to paint him as the aggressor. Where are they? Emilio asked. Warehouse on Pier 9. Waiting for your orders. Keep them breathing. I'll deal with them myself. Understood. Emilio ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. He stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, his mind calculating angles, consequences, blood debts that needed paying. But then a small voice cut through his thoughts. Is Mama going to wake up? He turned. Amelia stood in the doorway, barefoot, still wearing her torn pink dress. Someone, probably Vince, had found her a blanket, which she clutched around her shoulders like armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now. Cried out. She will, Emilio said. The doctor is very good. Amelia nodded slowly, then looked around the safe house, the expensive furniture, the tall windows overlooking the city, the art on the walls that cost more than her mother made in a year. Is this your house? One of them. She processed this in the way only children can, accepting the impossible because they have no framework to reject it. Do you have paper? She asked quietly. And crayons? Emilio blinked. Of all the things he expected her to ask for, art supplies weren't on the list. But he nodded. Wait here. He returned 5 minutes later with a yellow legal pad and a box of colored pencils, the closest thing to crayons in a house designed for business, not children. Amelia took them without a word and sat cross-legged on the leather couch. She began to draw, her small hand moving with intense focus, as though creating something beautiful could rebuild the world that had shattered around her. Emilio watched from the doorway. Dr. Reeves emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. She's stable, he said quietly. She'll need rest and monitoring, but she'll survive. Emilio nodded, but his eyes remained on Amelia. 30 minutes later, she held up her drawing. 3 figures sketched in wobbly lines and bright colors. On the left, a woman with long hair and a wide smile, labeled Mama, in uneven letters. In the middle, a small girl with pigtails, holding the woman's hand. Me. And on the right, a tall man in a dark suit, standing between them and a scribbled mass of shadows. One hand extended toward the little girl. Above his head, in careful block letters, Amelia had written, "The safe one." Emilio stared at the drawing. Something in his chest, that dead hollow place where his heart used to be, stirred. He had been many things in his life, a killer, a king, a ghost haunting the city's darkest corners. But no one had ever called him safe. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes searching for approval. It's you, she said simply. You keep the bad things away. Emilio swallowed hard. He took the drawing carefully, as though it were made of glass. Thank you, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Amelia smiled, small, fragile, but real. And in that moment, Emilio Costa realized something terrifying. He would burn the entire city to ash before he let anyone hurt this child again. The wine cellar beneath La Rosetta was a relic from another era. Stone walls that wept moisture, iron racks lined with bottles worth more than most people's homes, and a silence so complete it swallowed sound whole. It was also the last place many men ever saw. Emilio descended the narrow stairs, his footsteps echoing like a death knell. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the smell of aged wood and something darker, old fear, absorbed into the stones over decades. At the bottom, a single bulb swung from a wire, casting erratic shadows across the room. 2 men sat bound to heavy wooden chairs in the center of the space. Marcus Reed and Tony Galloway. Both in their 30s. Street hardened. Tattoos crawling up their necks. The kind of men who thought violence made them invincible. They thought wrong. Marcus's left eye was swollen shut. Tony's nose sat at an unnatural angle, blood crusted beneath it. Emilio's men had been persuasive during the capture. But they were conscious, alert, and terrified. Because Emilio Costa had arrived. He moved into the light slowly, methodically, his black coat making him look like a shadow given human form. His expression was blank, not angry, not cruel. Simply empty. That was somehow worse. Marco stood near the wall, arms crossed. Vince leaned against the wine rack, checking his watch. Business as usual. Emilio stopped 3 feet from the bound men and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded it carefully, and held it up so both men could see. Amelia's drawing. The colorful crayon lines. The smiling mother. The little girl. The tall man labeled. The safe one. Marcus squinted at it, confused. Tony's breathing quickened. "Do you know what this is?" Emilio asked. His voice was soft. Conversational. The tone you'd used to discuss the weather. Neither man answered. "This," Emilio continued, "was drawn by a 6-year-old girl about 4 hours ago. The same girl who watched you beat her mother unconscious." He lowered the drawing, his dark eyes locking on to Marcus. "She had to climb out a window and run 15 blocks through the city at night because of what you did." Marcus swallowed hard. "Look, man, we were just following." "I'm not finished," Emilio said quietly. Marcus shut his mouth. Emilio folded the drawing and returned it to his pocket, handling it like sacred text. "That little girl believes I can keep her safe." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room like rising water. "She called me the safe one. Do you understand what that means?" Silence. "It means I made her a promise," Emilio said. "And I keep my promises." Tony tried to steady his breathing, but his chest was heaving. "We didn't know she had a kid, man. We were just doing your job," Emilio finished. "Following orders." "Yes, I know." He tilted his head slightly. "Whose orders?" The two men exchanged glances. "We can't," Marcus started. Emilio moved so fast neither man saw it coming. One hand shot out, gripping Marcus by the throat, not squeezing, just holding. A reminder of how fragile the boundary between life and death really was. "Let me clarify something," Emilio said, his voice still calm, still terrifyingly soft. "You will tell me who gave the order. Not because I'm going to hurt you if you don't." He leaned in close, his face inches from Marcus's. "But because if you don't, I will find everyone you've ever cared about. Your mothers, your brothers, your girlfriends, the bartender you get drinks from on Fridays. And I will make sure they understand exactly what kind of man beats a defenseless woman in front of her child." He released Marcus's throat. "So. One more time." Emilio straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "Who gave the order?" Marcus coughed, gasping. "V. Victor Hale." "Victor Hale," Emilio repeated, committing the name to memory like a death warrant. "He's the boss," Tony added quickly, desperate now. "He said it was strategic. Said we needed to shake things up on 4th Street, make you look weak for not protecting your territory." "And Rhonda Mitchell?" "Random," Marcus rasped. "She was just there. Wrong place, wrong time." Emilio nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense. "I see." He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs with mechanical precision. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said pleasantly. "You've been very helpful." Marcus exhaled in relief. Tony actually smiled. They thought they were going to walk out of this cellar. Emilio turned to Marco and said one word. "Conclude." Marco nodded. Emilio walked toward the stairs, his footsteps measured and unhurried. Behind him, Marcus's voice cracked with sudden panic. "Wait, you said you weren't gonna?" "I said I wouldn't hurt you if you told me," Emilio replied without turning around. "I never said what would happen after." The door at the top of the stairs closed with a soft click. The bulb swung. Shadows danced across stone walls. And in the wine cellar beneath La Rosetta, two men learned the difference between mercy and inevitability. By the time Emilio returned to the safe house, his hands were clean and his expression unchanged. But the name Victor Hale was carved into his mind like a gravestone waiting to be filled. Victor Hale's warehouse sat on the industrial edge of the Bronx like a rusted crown, all corrugated metal and broken windows, surrounded by chain-link fence and the kind of darkness that swallowed street lights whole. Inside, Hale held court at a card table surrounded by his lieutenants. Smoke curled from cheap cigars. Money was being counted, drugs weighed, territories discussed. The Iron Jacks were ascending, or so they believed. Then the doors exploded inward. Not kicked. Not picked. Blown open by precision charges that turned steel hinges into shrapnel. Emilio Costa walked through the smoke like a funeral procession, 6 armed men flanking him in perfect formation. No ski masks. No subtlety. They wanted to be seen. Wanted to be remembered. Hale's men scrambled for weapons, but froze when they saw the red laser dots painting their chests from the catwalks above. Snipers. Already in position. Emilio had owned this room before he'd even entered it. Victor Hale, Emilio said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. Hale stood slowly, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and a suit that tried too hard. He'd built his reputation on being untouchable, unpredictable, dangerous. But standing across from Emilio Costa, he suddenly looked very small. Costa. Hale forced a smile, spreading his hands. I was wondering when you'd show up. Look, if this is about 4th Street, we can talk boundaries. I'm a reasonable man. Sit down, Emilio said. It wasn't a request. Hale sat. Emilio moved forward with measured steps, his coat billowing slightly, his expression carved from granite. He stopped at the edge of the table, looming over Hale like an executioner at the scaffold. You think I came here to negotiate? Emilio said quietly. Hale shifted in his seat. We can work something out. Split the district, move some product through different channels. You beat a woman half to death in her own home. Emilio continued, as though Hale hadn't spoken. A woman who worked 2 jobs to feed her daughter. A woman whose only crime was filing a complaint about suspicious activity in her building. Hale's smile faltered. That was just business, man. We were sending a message. You sent the wrong message. Emilio placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his shadow swallowing Hale whole. That woman's 6-year-old daughter climbed out a window and ran 15 blocks through the night. She was terrified. Bleeding. Alone. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. And she ran to me. The warehouse had gone silent. Even Hale's men stood frozen, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. So here's what's going to happen, Emilio said, straightening. Your extortion ring on 4th Street? Shut down. Immediately. Every dollar you stole from those families? Returned by sunrise. Hale's face reddened. You can't just. Your 2 warehouses on Pier 7 and Pier 11? Emilio continued as if Hale hadn't spoken. There'll be ashes by morning. That's millions of dollars of. And you, Emilio said, his eyes boring into Hale's, will abandon the entire southern district. Not just 4th Street. All of it. You will pull your men, your product, your influence. You will vanish from that territory like you were never there. Hale shot to his feet, outrage overriding survival instinct. You're out of your mind. Do you know what the other families will think if I just roll over for? Emilio moved. One hand shot out, gripping the back of Hale's head and slamming it down onto the table with enough force to crack wood. Cards scattered. Money flew. Hale's lieutenants reached for weapons but froze as Emilio's men raised theirs in perfect synchronization. Emilio held Hale's face pressed against the table, his voice calm, almost conversational. You laid hands on a mother, he said softly. And you made a child run to me for protection. He leaned closer, his breath cold against Hale's ear. That child drew me a picture and called me the safe one. He released Hale's head and stepped back. Hale pushed himself upright, gasping, his nose bleeding, his eyes wild with fury and fear. Emilio adjusted his cuffs with mechanical precision. You will not survive a second mistake, he said, his tone flat and final. Do you understand? Hale stared at him, chest heaving, blood dripping onto his expensive shirt. For 15 years, Victor Hale had clawed his way up from street dealer to crime boss by reading people, by knowing when to push and when to fold. And what he saw in Emilio Costa's eyes terrified him. This wasn't about territory. This wasn't about money or power or respect. This was personal. Emilio Costa, the man who operated like a machine, who removed emotion from every decision, who turned violence into mathematics, had become something far more dangerous. He had become protective. I understand, Hale whispered. Good. Emilio turned and walked toward the shattered doors, his men following in formation. Behind him, Hale collapsed into his chair, shaking. By dawn, 2 warehouses would burn. By noon, every stolen dollar would be returned. By sunset, the Iron Jacks would be ghosts in the Southern District. And Victor Hale would spend the rest of his life wondering what kind of monster he had awakened. Outside, as the first warehouse erupted in flames against the pre-dawn sky, Marco glanced at Emilio. Boss, he said carefully. That wasn't like you. Emilio watched the fire climb into the darkness, painting the clouds orange and gold. No, he agreed quietly. It wasn't. But somewhere across the city, a little girl slept safely in a bed that wasn't hers, clutching a drawing she'd made. And for the first time in 10 years, Emilio Costa felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. Rhonda woke to the sound of monitors beeping softly and morning light filtering through expensive curtains she didn't recognize. Her body screamed in protest as she tried to move. Broken ribs. Bandaged arms. The metallic taste of blood still lingering in her mouth. Memory flooded back in jagged pieces, fists, shouting pain, Amelia's screams. Amelia. Panic seized her chest. She tried to sit up, gasping, but gentle hands pressed her shoulders back down. Easy, a calm voice said. Dr. Reeves appeared in her vision, gray-haired and professional. You're safe. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. My daughter, Rhonda's voice cracked, raw and desperate, is right here. The doctor stepped aside. Amelia sat curled in an oversized armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, clutching a stuffed bear someone had given her. When she saw her mother's eyes open, she scrambled down and ran to the bedside. Mama! Rhonda's tears came instantly, relief and anguish mixing into something too big to contain. Baby, I'm so sorry, You're okay, Amelia whispered, her small hand gripping her mother's like a lifeline. The safe man fixed you. Rhonda blinked through her tears, confused. What? The door opened. Emilio Costa entered like a shadow made solid, his presence filling the room without effort. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Marco waited in the hallway, ever watchful. Rhonda's breath caught. She knew that face. Everyone in the city knew that face, even if they'd never seen it in person. The stories, the whispers, the warnings parents gave their children about staying out of Costa's way. Fear flickered across her features. Don't be afraid, Emilio said quietly, stopping at the foot of her bed. You're under my protection now. Rhonda's mind raced, trying to make sense of impossible things. I don't understand. Why would you? Your daughter came to me, Emilio said simply. She asked for help. I gave it. Rhonda looked at Amelia, who nodded solemnly. I found him at the fancy restaurant, Amelia explained. The men in the neighborhood said he fixes things. So I ran there. Rhonda's hand flew to her mouth, fresh tears spilling. Her 6-year-old daughter had run through the city at night, alone and terrified, to find a Mafia boss because she believed he was safer than the police. What kind of world had they created? Thank you? Rhonda whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to thank you. I don't have money. I can't. I don't want your money. Emilio interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. Then what? Nothing. He met her eyes, and for a moment, something almost human flickered behind his carefully constructed walls. Your daughter's safe. You're recovering. That's enough. Rhonda stared at him, searching for the trap, the catch, the price that would come due. She found none. The men who hurt you won't return, Emilio continued. They've been dealt with. You can go back to your apartment when you're ready, or I can arrange somewhere else. Your choice. Rhonda looked around the room, the medical equipment, the comfortable furniture, the window overlooking a part of the city she'd only ever seen from below. How long can we stay here? As long as you need. Amelia climbed carefully onto the bed, nestling against her mother's good side. Rhonda wrapped her arm around her daughter, holding her like she'd never let go. Mr. Costa, Rhonda said softly. I don't know why you did this. But thank you. Truly. Emilio nodded once, then turned to leave. Wait, Amelia called. He paused. She slipped off the bed and crossed to him, then wrapped her small arms around his leg in a fierce hug. Emilio froze. His men would later swear they saw something crack in his expression, some ancient ice beginning to thaw. Slowly, carefully, as though he'd forgotten how, Emilio placed his hand on top of Amelia's head. You're welcome, he said quietly. When she finally released him and returned to her mother, Emilio looked at them both, this broken family he'd had no intention of saving, who had somehow saved something in him instead. I'll check on you tomorrow, he said. And he did. 1 week later, Emilio arrived at the recovery suite every afternoon at 3 o'clock, like clockwork. Sometimes he stayed for 5 minutes. Sometimes an hour. He brought books for Amelia, proper food for Rhonda, ensured Dr. Reeves had everything he needed. He never asked for gratitude. Never expected anything in return. He just showed up. Amelia drew him more pictures. Rhonda told him stories about the diner, about customers who left terrible tips and health inspectors who demanded bribes. Small talk that should have meant nothing to a man who trafficked in violence and power. But he listened. And somewhere in those quiet afternoons, in that recovery suite high above a city he controlled through fear, Emilio Costa began to remember what it felt like to care. The neighborhood whispered. You hear about Rhonda Mitchell? Costa himself stepped in. Beat down the Iron Jacks. For a woman who ain't even connected. That's not like him. They say it was because of her kid. Little girl ran right to him. Man who doesn't feel anything, and a 6-year-old changed him. The rumors spread like wildfire through 4th Street, then beyond. A Mafia boss who protected a single mother. Who visited her like family. Who'd gone to war not for territory or profit, but for a child who believed he could save her. People started looking at Emilio Costa differently. And in the quiet moments when Amelia fell asleep against his side while he read to her, or when Rhonda smiled at him with genuine warmth instead of fear, Emilio started looking at himself differently too. The walls he'd built were still there. But for the first time in 10 years he'd opened a door. The apartment looked different. Not just repaired, transformed. The shattered door had been replaced with solid oak, triple-locked. Fresh paint covered the scuffed walls in warm cream tones. New furniture sat where broken pieces once lay. The windows had new curtains that actually blocked out the streetlights. Even the worn linoleum had been replaced with clean tile that didn't crack underfoot. Someone had left an envelope on the kitchen counter with no return address. Inside, 6 months of rent, paid in full. Rhonda stood in her living room, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew exactly who had done this. 3 weeks had passed since she'd woken in that recovery suite. 3 weeks of healing, of nightmares slowly fading, of watching her daughter smile again without flinching at sudden sounds. 3 weeks of daily visits from a man the world called a monster. Today, Amelia sat cross-legged on the new couch, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on another drawing. Crayons scattered around her like rainbow shrapnel. The coffee table was covered in her artwork now, pictures of flowers, of her school, of the safe house where they'd stayed. And always, in the corner of each drawing, a tall figure in black. The safe one. Rhonda was folding laundry when the knock came, 3 gentle taps, not the pounding that still haunted her dreams. She opened the door. Emilio stood in the hallway, hands in his coat pockets, looking somehow smaller than usual. Quieter. There was something different in his eyes today, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, as though he wasn't sure he belonged here. "Mr. Costa," Rhonda said softly. "The apartment," he began, then stopped. Started again. "I hope it's—" "Thank you." She stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Please. Come in." He entered slowly, taking in the changes with a careful eye. Making sure everything was right. Making sure they were safe. "Emilio!" Amelia launched herself off the couch and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist with the kind of fearless joy only children possess. No hesitation. No memory of who he was supposed to be. Just happiness that he was here. Emilio's hand found her head automatically now, a gesture that had become natural over these weeks. His thumb brushed gently over her braided hair. "Hello, princess," he said quietly. "I'm drawing." Amelia grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the couch. "Come see." Rhonda watched them, this impossible pair, this connection that shouldn't exist, and felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. Emilio sat beside Amelia, his expensive suit incongruous against the modest furniture, and studied her latest creation. 3 figures. A house with flowers. A sun that took up half the page. "It's us," Amelia explained. "Mama, me, and you." Emilio stared at the drawing for a long moment. In it, the 3 figures stood together, smiling. The tall man in black had his arms spread wide, as though protecting the other 2 from storms the paper couldn't show. Something in Emilio's chest, that hollow, frozen place, cracked open completely. He wasn't a ghost anymore. Wasn't just walking through life waiting for the inevitable end. He was here. Present. Part of something that mattered beyond blood and territory and fear. Here. Amelia pressed a crayon into his hand, blue, like the sky in her drawing. "Draw with me. You're part of it." Emilio looked at the crayon in his palm. His hands, which had ended lives with clinical precision, which had broken bones and signed death warrants, trembled slightly. "I'm not good at drawing," he said. "That's okay," Amelia said simply. "Nobody's good at first. You just have to try." Rhonda moved quietly to the kitchen, giving them space, but watching from the corner of her eye as she put dishes away. Emilio lowered the crayon to paper. His lines were shaky. Uncertain. A bird that looked more like a mistake than anything with wings. A tree that tilted dangerously to one side. Amelia giggled. "It's perfect." "It's terrible," Emilio corrected, but there was the faintest hint of a smile pulling at his lips. "No," Amelia said seriously, placing her small hand over his larger one. "It's yours. That makes it perfect." They drew together in comfortable silence. A child teaching a killer how to create instead of destroy, how to add color to a world he'd painted only in shades of black. When they finished, Amelia held up the paper triumphantly. The 3 figures on the page were holding hands now, connected by wobbly lines and bright colors. Above them, Emilio's lopsided bird flew through a sky filled with Amelia's stars. At the bottom, in Amelia's careful letters, "My family." Emilio stared at those 2 words. His throat tightened. His vision blurred at the edges. For 10 years, he'd been alone. Deliberately. Safely. For 10 years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was strength. But sitting here, with crayon dust on his fingers and a child's laughter in his ears and a mother's grateful smile from across the room, Emilio Costa realized something profound. He had been surviving. Now, finally, he was living. "Can you come back tomorrow?" Amelia asked, leaning against his shoulder. Emilio looked down at her, this brave, beautiful child who had shattered his carefully constructed walls with nothing but trust and a desperate plea. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll come back. Promise?" He thought of Sophia. Of the promises he'd made and couldn't keep. But he also thought of the drawing in his coat pocket, of the apartment he'd rebuilt, of the neighborhood that now whispered about a Mafia boss who'd chosen mercy over violence. "I promise," Emilio said. And this time, he meant it. Later that night, alone in his penthouse overlooking the city he ruled, Emilio placed Amelia's drawing on his desk beside a framed photo he hadn't looked at in years. Sophia, smiling, 7 years old, holding up butterfly wings. 2 little girls. One he'd lost. One he'd saved. And in saving her, she had somehow saved him too. The man once feared by thousands sat in the darkness, crayons scattered on mahogany worth more than most people's cars, and allowed himself to feel something he thought was dead forever. Hope. Not for redemption. Not for forgiveness. But for something simpler, more profound. A reason to keep going. A family he never expected. A home in the last place he thought to find it. Emilio Costa was still a dangerous man. Still a killer. Still the most feared figure on the East Coast. But now, when Amelia drew him, she didn't draw a monster. She drew a smile. And that made all the difference. For 10 years, Emilio lived in silence and isolation, until Amelia showed him a world of color again. If you want to see more stories about the light that can be found in the darkest places, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support really goes a long way. Don't forget to share this story to help us grow, and like the video if you think Amelia was the hero Emilio didn't know he needed. Comment, family, if you were touched by Emilio's promise to stay. I read every one of them.